Great to see you as well. Glad you could join us today. So we're coming up on 3 o'clock our time. We'll give folks just a couple of more minutes to get joined in and to get rolling. But as everybody kind of gets settled, make sure you have a glass of water, and hopefully we have some great engaging stuff for you today. We'll give folks just a couple more minutes to get logged in, and then we'll get rolling.
And as we begin to settle in here, we'd love to hear where everyone is joining us from. So feel free to drop where you're from in the chat and a word about how you're feeling today.
Hey, Holly, great. Thanks for joining us. Adam, you chilling? All right, I like it. I appreciate you. Holly coming all the way from Seattle, feeling optimistic. We got some folks in Michigan, very stressed. Hopefully this will kind of help in bringing down that stress level today. We've got some Boston folks. Okay, awesome. Bay Trail Middle School from New York. Awesome. So we saw folks from across the country on the list. We're super excited to have folks in. Okay, we got some folks from Washington, feeling well, feeling good. All right, Tony, thanks for joining us from Boston. Chicago Middle School, Donnie, appreciate you. Wendy, it's great to have you. Super excited to be back in community with you. Awesome. So as more folks are coming in, feel free to drop into the chat where you're joining us from today, and how you're feeling.
Another Oregon leader. Happy to have you, Casey. And Lynn from Los Angeles.
Minneapolis. We got folks from all over. This is awesome. This is great. Okay, Lauren, I'm going to go ahead. It looks like it's about 3:02 here Central. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen, and we can get started. Awesome.
Okay, that sounds great. Again, thank you all so much for joining us today. Nick and I are really excited to be able to share some of the research that we've been able to do and share these ideas on data as a tool for equity. And I am Lauren Catulli. I'm one of the strategic partnerships managers here at Innovare, and I work with nonprofit leaders and charter school leaders, public school leaders across the country, helping to build relationships here on our team. And prior to joining the Innovare team, I worked in the charter school space for a while, working on social emotional curriculum, and really excited to be a part of the change that we're making with so many leaders across this space right now. And I'll be helping facilitate the conversation today along with our president, Nick.
Hey, everybody. Great to be here in community with you all. My name is Nick Freeman, co-founder and president with Innovare Social Innovation Partners. Actually coming to you all out of Chicago Public Schools as a data strategist. Prior to that, I was actually a private sector transplant, where I started off in the financial world. But again, the impact that I was having, didn't really support the community that I came from. So again, that was my transition into education. But again, super excited to be here with you all and to be able to share a little bit more around the research that we use to ground ourselves in the work that we're developing. So just to give you a little bit more context around us as Innovare. So Innovare, we have our data strategy app, Inno. Again, that we're really working to equip our education leaders with those powerful insights and in the triangulation of their data sources. As I'm sure all of you all have experienced and consistently experienced, is an overwhelming amount of data, especially now in the time of COVID, where we're trying to figure out how do we measure success in a not so common time, right? So how do we track student engagement? How do we ensure that we're seeing that level of interaction with our stakeholder groups, and how are we assessing for student improvement as well? So that's the first side of our app, and as that data side. On the other side, it's really around the strategy, right? So how do we ensure that now that we have these powerful insights from our data, we're really using them to inform our work? So again, it allows for us to run those rapid cycles of PDSA, so that plan, do, study, act model that allows for us to, again, not only understand our data and understand the insights that our data are providing, but then again to address any, root causes of inconsistent performance that we may see. So again, data only gets us so far. It's really the strategy that helps us improve those overall indicators. So just a little bit about today's agenda. So first, we're going to really start talking around building a race equity culture within our organizations. This is going to look different for everyone. So again, knowing that we're bringing to you, best in class research around this. This isn't stuff that we've just created on our own. We've really crowdsourced from a lot of organizations out there that are leading in the industry around this work that we want to be sure that we're sharing with you. Then we'll talk around a little bit more around equitable data practice and how do we ensure that we're implementing cycles of learning. And then how do we apply this equity awareness when we're creating our visualizations? How do we ensure that we're providing powerful, insightful data that also is representing our stakeholders appropriately? And then lastly, any questions that do come up, we'll be sure to facilitate them at the end of the session. So just a kind of a little bit of the session interaction side of thing. We will be using some poll functionality because want to make sure that you all have an option or opportunity to share about yourselves. We're actually about to launch a poll right now just to get an understanding of the roles that we have in the room. So just want to be sure that we kind of have a good sense of the role that you play within your organization. So you all should see a poll coming up onto your chat right now. If you could just give us a sense of what role do you play? So whether you're a school building leader, a teacher, a network leader, a nonprofit leader, a social entrepreneur like ourselves, again, let us know who's in the room. And kind of as you all are filling that out, I'll just give us a couple of more context. So we also have the Zoom chat where we see folks are already engaging in. We appreciate you all. Please, continue to engage. You also have the option to communicate with just us as the panelists, or you can also communicate with other individuals within the session, or you can also, share, broadly across the session as well. Please, if you have any questions, you'll also see a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen that we would ask that you house those questions in. That will allow for us, we have some time on the back end to get to any of those questions that we have the ability to align to and make sure that we get those questions answered. And then lastly, on the social media aspect, if there's any aspect around anybody, I know we got folks on Facebook Live, that's the one I'm used to, but this session we're actually also doing on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. So again, we appreciate all of our folks that are out there in the social media space that are following along today. And feel free to, like, reshare, tweet. We do have people on that aspect as well that will be engaging with you. So again, we're super excited about our session. Thank you, Iser, for kicking off the session for us with this poll. And we can see we have a very wide range of folks in this session together. Super excited. We hope that the information and content that we have for you all today, and I'll say I know we have the information and content for you all today, so you can really see across the board on how we can really support all of you all. So again, we're super excited to kind of jump into our session today, and that's what we're going to do. So the first piece we're really going to talk around is, work coming out of equity in the center. And again, I'm going to put a big shout out to one of our advisors, Kay, who is the executive director at the Equity in the Center, where they're really leading the work around, how we ensure equity is embedded across our systems, our structures, and within our organizations. And really what they speak towards is how diversity has been so commonly used, and unfortunately it's becoming misused and really becoming one of those buzzwords and not really capturing the exact designation that we're really looking to impact in our work. So again, we want to move away from equity as just representation. Right, we don't want this to be a structure where we're just thinking about increasing representation, but explicitly prioritizing, identify the structures, the roles, the processes, and the practices that are in place that actually have a negative impact on folks of color and people that are in more impoverished neighborhoods. So ensuring that we always have that lens of equity in our work is something that we want to kind of key in. And the reason for this work, I think, is kind of broad across the landscape, right? Whether it's the racial leadership gap that exists in our organizations, whether it's that untapped potential of those diverse teams to bring different areas of expertise to the table, and then specifically in our race outcome gaps, whether it's education, where historically we've seen our African American students on the lower performing end in comparison to their white peers, or whether it's on that wealth and economic stability, where we look at, where white American households actually hold about 86 times more wealth than our African American households, or if we think about our incarceration rates, where our African Americans in state prisons are actually in at about 5 times the rate. So again, across the board, we really have to be navigating in this work. And again, at Equity in the Center, they have brought to us, what they call the race equity cycle. And in this race equity cycle, it really breaks down the work into 7 particular levers that you can see here, whether, senior leaders, our data, our organizational culture, the learning environment, our board of directors, the communities, our managers are all key levers in how we ensure that we have, an equitable race equity cycle in place. And what they've also done is define kind of 3 categorizations around organization stage. And again, everybody's organization is in a different place, and that's okay. Really, it starts with us having a framework that we can align to. And again, this is one of the frameworks that we've used and we've utilized internally at Innovare and shared with our partners, just because, again, of the alignment to our work and its intended impact that it's having and its positive impact that it has that we've aligned to. But there's plenty of other frameworks out there. Your district or your organization may have some particular frameworks that you will already align to. And again, as long as we have a way to assess our performance. So a little bit specifically of what I would share here is kind of the stages and that organizations tend to fall into. That first stage is really that awake stage, right? This is the one that I was kind of talking about earlier, where representation is key, right? And the goal is just aimed at increasing our representation of our African American population or of women on our team. Again, not really understanding the impact of some of those larger scales at work, right? That's when we start to move into our work stage, right? So this moves past just inclusion, but also starts to bring in kind of the internal change in behaviors, the internal change in policy and practices as well. And then lastly, we really bring into this work stage, right? So this is the work where we really want to, our organizations are focused on the systems to improve racial equity, right? And the primary goal here is to really ensure that racial equity is integrated across all aspects of our organization, right? So again, across these 7 levers that we see, we want to make sure that there is a common structure behind the scenes. So really, in what you'll read into the research, and again, all of the content and research that we use for today's presentation, we will be sharing with you all. And again, we hope that you all utilize these tools and can engage with these tools as well. And we're more than happy to share in the experience of implementation. But kind of just lastly on this race equity cycle, the key steps that we have to take are first making sure that we have this shared vocabulary around this work. Second is making sure that we have champions outside our organization and within leadership that are driving this work. We have to name racial equity as a strategic initiative of our organization and truly have it front and center, and make sure that we have this continuous dialogue that goes along the work of racial equity. And lastly, what they say is it's really about the data, right? We have to be able to disaggregate our data. We have to be able to utilize that data to inform our structure. And that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time today. How do we create these systems and cycles of learning when it comes into this information, and particularly around the equitable usage of our data? So with that, again, as I mentioned, I want to keep us interactive today. We're going to launch one more poll question where just a quick understanding. Again, everybody's at a different stage. We would just love to know, based on those kind of 3 categorizations, awake, woke, or work, where do you feel your organization currently falls? Again, we all have areas to improve. And if you want to, think about maybe one particular level, feel free to share it in that manner. Or again, just let us know how you feel that organization. Again, that awake stage is where we're really aimed at increasing representation, and that woke stage is where we're starting to bring in that inclusion and the change in behaviors of our policies and practice. And lastly, on that woke stage, this is where we're embedding it across the organization, right? Making sure that we're putting in the actions to ensure that we have this racial equity culture. So again, we'll give folks just about a minute, probably about 30 seconds now, to go ahead, drop in your vote on where you fall into this awake, woke, or work stage.
I see Ernesto's comment there, needing a recognition stage.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah. And feel free, as you're filling out that poll response, if you have any questions or if anything resonates, feel free to drop that in the chat or post a question in the Q&A section.
Awesome. So Iser, if we can go ahead and I know folks have had a moment, we'll go ahead, get these ones to share out, and we'll see how everybody kind of shared themselves. Okay, so kind of even across the board, some folks in that awake stage, some folks in that woke stage, some folks working into that work stage. Again, for us, we want to make sure that we're differentiating and meeting your all's needs. So again, we appreciate the insights on where you all feel you fall into these areas. And again, that's just great context for us to continue along with this presentation. So again, more research that we're building this presentation from, and Lauren is going to speak a little bit more in detail on the particular areas. And as we're thinking about this equitable data practice, and so this is information that we have coming from AISP, from the University of Penn, and the Urban Institute. Again, we're really building and operationalizing best practice research here. So in thinking about that equitable data cycle, there's really 6 phases. And again, I'll just give us a high overview before Lauren kind of takes us into a little bit more detail in each of these aspects. The first one is really around our planning, right? So this is where we really have to ensure that, we're preparing for those future stages of our work. And it's essential that at this point, we're embedding equity in this lens as well, right? We have to be sure that, as I've mentioned before, it's a centerpiece of our strategic initiatives. It's a centerpiece, and, our leadership are bought into these practices as well as we're building out. The second piece is around data collection. Pretty straightforward there. Like, how are we collecting our data? In the education space, there's various ways. I always say we're super data rich, and we're just getting more and more data savvy as we go along, right? Understanding how do we utilize the data, whether it's through, forms that, are submitted through parent engagement surveys, or how, student assessment is being provided, or how we're, assessing, superintendent, performance, those sorts of things that, we can collect data in multiple various ways. The next piece is really around data access, right? So this is now around starting to think about the ability to obtain this information and utilize this information and ensure that it's being used for its intended purpose, right? Making sure data is in the right appropriate hands, that we're not oversharing information or undersharing information, and truly able to tell the story. The next piece that we'll dive into as well is really around the statistical tools. For all of my data nerds out there, this is where you and I are going to get along really well. Again, this starts to get into understanding how do we use the tools to ensure that we're creating transparency and allowing for us to assess our intended impact versus unintended impact. Because again, this is a continuous cycle that we're continuously learning and improving as we go along. That second to last stage is really around the analysis, where this is where we're really starting to explore our data and understand what's within our data, to start to identify any root causes that we may be able to see, or being able to start to draw any particular conclusions. And then lastly, the last stage around the cycle is really around reporting, right? So how do we ensure that the dissemination of our data, whether it's to our internal or external stakeholders, is in an easy format, an understandable format. There's a data literacy that's aligned and commonality across the board that we want to ensure. So again, I appreciate everybody for being here with us today. I'm getting ready to kick it over to Lauren, if you're ready to jump in to take us through these cycles.
Yes, thank you so much, Nick. So as we first jump into planning as this first integral part of equitable data cycles, we want to be thinking about how this is the time to really plan and articulate the vision for how we want to move through this process. And it's so common that we can let the forward momentum of any new project or initiative help take us forward without taking the time to really pause and embed an equity framework into our plan moving forward. So really, there are a few areas which we recommend focusing on. One, that proactive planning. How are we embedding that into every part of the data cycle, which we'll move through the other 5 parts in just a moment. But then looking at the community interests, seeking to include stakeholders from all around our communities, and also embedding frameworks in. We have an opportunity here to really set the foundation for how we want to move forward throughout this process. And what I would also mention, I know we have leaders from multiple different roles. We all have an opportunity to play a role here and provide insight to how we want this strategy to move forward, even if we are not the one singularly, designing or managing the data cycle process. So onto data collection, as Nick mentioned, we can be gathering and collecting data from multiple different ways, whether it's a form, whether it's in a Google spreadsheet. And it's important for us in the beginning to identify what those best practices are for securing the data as it's being collected. Also respecting the privacy of those who we're collecting data about and from to ensure that their rights are being respected throughout the process. Next is around adaptive systems. How are we?
And I would,
Yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
I'm sorry, Lauren. No, go ahead. I apologize.
No. Feel free to jump in after this one. I know we were talking about it earlier around adaptive systems, creating, a really flexible system for us to be able to iterate and change as we move through the data cycle, depending on what we may be seeing. So Nick, you want to shed some light on
Obviously,
this one?
I get excited about these topics if you can't tell. Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, so this one is really around, when we're thinking about the adaptability, one thing that we want to ensure, stays constant is, the cleanliness of our data, right? So when we talk about the adaptability, we're not talking around the changing of our data or the restructuring of the data. Really what we want to be thinking about is how can we build systems that can easily integrate with one another? Lauren brought up a great point. I'm sure a lot of folks out there are Google users, right? And using G Suite, whether it's around Google Forms or Google Sheets or Google Presentations, Google Docs, Google Meet. Again, there's lots of different ways that we're interacting. And, with systems that allow for us to, structure data, in such a way that, a Google Sheet would, right? So when we talk about the ability to adjust and adapt, it really comes down to, for example, this year, when we really started thinking about, having to find a new way to track and monitor student engagement during the times to, build out and create tools where, with a couple of our partners, we actually built frameworks around what quality engagement looks like, right? Not necessarily just the checking the box of getting onto a Google Hangout or submitting a document, really, unpacking it into, the quality of that engagement. And then what we were able to do, and again, this brings in that agileness of the systems, we were able to triangulate that information with the student priority group information, right? So being able to tie in race, gender, IEP status, diverse learner status to ensure that, equity exists kind of across the board. So again, when we talk about that adaptiveness and the nimbleness of our systems, we want to make sure that we're not creating data in silos, right? Again, that's one of the things at Innovare that we really pride ourselves on as a part of our process in creating, very equitable and valuable dashboards and visualizations for our partners. The first step around it is really triangulating sources, right? So whether we're pulling information from, Aspen or a Power School or Infinite Campus as a student information system and triangulating that data again with information that we might be collecting through Google Sheets. And then maybe we want to triangulate, the level of engagement that we have with the caregiver or family members. So again, when that nimbleness and the ability for our systems to be flexible, because as we know, in education, things are rapidly changing on a consistent basis. So we want to be sure that our tools are developed in a manner that allow for us to adapt and change. Again, I remember when I was working in Chicago public schools, my boss always told me, like, nobody likes change but a wet baby, right? So again, we have to make sure that we're comfortable with change, right? We know that change consistently comes, and specifically with our data systems, we have to be prepared for that change to happen. And in such, we want to be sure that we're creating systems that have the ability to adapt and adjust. So thanks, Lauren, for letting me get in on that one. This stuff I'm super excited about, so I appreciate you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up remote engagement, especially as we move into this next point, because I was talking to a leader this morning. Actually, if you go back one slide around this qualitative context. So we are collecting a number of different types of data across different systems. And as we'll move through this presentation, a lot of what we'll be talking about is how to bring an empathetic approach, how to bring that qualitative story to shed light on what is truly happening within the community, within the school that we're serving. And so as we look at something like remote engagement, we may be tracking a lot of quantitative data there, but what else is lying in between the data that we can help really create and share the story of what is happening for an individual student's experience, certainly as we've navigated remote learning over the past year. So we'll continue to tap back into how we can provide that empathetic approach throughout the data cycle and the visualizations we use. Great. So this moves us on to data access. And as you see here, there are typically three different types of data access as we look at it. And it generally refers to who can securely see, access, obtain the data. So first we have open. This is the public data that anyone may be able to have access to. Next is restricted, data that can be shared, but under certain circumstances. And the last is around unavailable data. So data that cannot or should not be shared, either because of certain laws in place or data quality or other concerns. And it's important for us to recognize here that both restricting and making data available can lead to equity concerns and unintended consequences. So we recommend using a multi-tiered approach based on the research that we found, where we're using a combination here and really reflecting as we begin the process to identify and ask ourselves why we would want certain data to be open, whether it should be restricted or unavailable. And that moves us on to, I know, one of Nick's favorite topics here, algorithms and statistical tools. So one of the first things to recognize is that when we're using algorithms and statistical tools, there is no such thing as a race-neutral algorithm, given there is a human being behind that creation, and it can reflect the biases of those who create them and the data used in their processes. So to help mitigate that bias that may be in the tool, there are a few recommendations here. One is around responsibility, creating clear channels for communication about the potential impacts as a result of using certain algorithms. The next is explainability. So being able to disseminate this information in a way that reduces the use of technical type language. Third, around accuracy. So how are we identifying, logging, and explaining sources of error and maybe uncertainty so that any intended or unintended consequences can be anticipated upfront? Next, around audibility. So here, really thinking about, are there third parties? Are there people outside of our data cycle that we can tap into to help shed more light into strengthening the tool to remove, again, any unintended biases that we may not be able to have caught? I know one thing, and I'll turn it over to Nick to provide even more example here, is something we do here at Innovare is tap into the school leaders within our community, but aren't directly on our team. So we can get that input from key stakeholders. And then lastly, around fairness. So ensuring that the decisions that we are making do not create any discriminatory or unjust impacts. Nick, do you want to go back and shed some light there?
Yeah, no, there's a few exciting things that we have going on at Innovare. So kind of just speaking towards I'll just share an example from just how we typically use continuing success measures or on track metrics that are defined by measures of success that are typically attendance and grades. And again, if we just look at the historical data of education and we look at attendance and we look at grades, like, you don't even have to show me the charts, right? I can tell you off the top of my head which priority groups are going to be performing the highest, which priority groups are going to be performing the lowest. So it's really important for us to be able to, again, put in that humanistic aspect to ensure that we're not only just looking at this algorithm to provide us all the answers, because as Lauren just mentioned, right, a human is behind that algorithm, right? Or humans are behind that algorithm. And for instance, a perfect example is the work we're doing at Innovare right now on the strategy side of our work, where we are building out an algorithm and a tool for our Inno app to begin to start to push and suggest actions to our leaders as they're creating their strategies, right? So as they're thinking about their priority around diversity, equity, inclusion, we're going to have content or from best practice research that will be pushed to those partners and allow for them to choose and see. But again, like, we understand and we're very intentional about a few things as it comes to controlling our own biases. So the ways that we're working to control for that, and again, it's not perfect, and again, we're always learning and ensuring that we can consistently improve in controlling those biases. But what we've done is ensure that we've enlisted our team and enlisted our researchers along with education leaders as well to source and provide us with the insights around what strategies they're using, what actions do they see as most useful, which actions have they gotten the most impact. But again, as we shared before, like those education leaders are humans as well, right? So again, there's biases that are behind that as well. So again, the best way to control for them is just to ensure that we have various levels of stakeholder groups that are engaging in these processes when we're thinking about, again, these algorithms and statistical tools, because I'm one that loves data, right? Anybody who knows me can, tell you I'm a data nerd, a self-proclaimed data nerd, and I'm proud of it. But again, I also understand the impact of the data, and we really want to be sure that, we're not looking at data as just numbers. Again, we want to see the faces and the individuals behind those. We want to be sure that we have the ability to tell a true story of those individuals, that, and not just a true story, but one that they would be proud of. As Lauren mentioned as well, that fairness and that accuracy, right? We really want to ensure that the story is being told of those stakeholders in the appropriate manner, and in a manner that makes them proud and allows them to really feel and breathe that aspect as well. So the last piece I'll kind of just add on this algorithm is there's plenty of tools out there. It does start to work into kind of that advanced technology. It can get very, very advanced, or it could be very simple. Right. Again, it could be to the simple point where, we're creating, just a way to, create our MTSS interventions, right? Where we can create a system that maybe pulls in an on-track rate, that maybe pulls in some sort of engagement measure, and something else that pulls in, an indicator around academic performance, let's say, right? And that system alone can be seen as a statistical tool or an algorithm that will help for us to identify which menu or which menu item of supports that our students, or that maybe some of our teachers may need as well. So again, these are I could talk for days on this. I'm going to kick back over to Lauren before I take the mic for too long on this. But again, thanks for bringing me in on this one, Lauren.
Absolutely. And I love how you talked about the story behind the data, because that really brings us into the analysis here. And it's so critical at this point that we are not looking just at the data that we have available right in front of us, but we're also looking at the historical context within the communities that we're working with to really understand the individual, the community, the political context, the historical context of race, to identify how that may impact the data that we're looking at, the community that we're working with. And so coming to that in any type of analysis can be very helpful, along with really focusing on these 4 areas, which we've outlined here. So first is around which data are we including and excluding, and determining that as a team of what we want to be able to include in the analysis. The next, stakeholders, identifying who's going to be a part of that process to decide which data we're using and what the data means. Thirdly, transparency, being transparent about the limits of the data. If we think about that idea of telling the story, we know that even, if we're trying to get to that holistic view, there may be some key components missing that we may want to communicate out, we're going to look into further. And the last is around community input. So seeking out and incorporating community's interpretation of the data, so that again, we may be able to gain perspective across the community, not just within our leadership or within our team. And that brings us to the 6th point around reporting and dissemination. So now we have all of the data, the analysis at our fingertips. How are we working to share that out? And here we really want to be reflecting on the audience. Who are the different stakeholders we're going to be sharing this information out to? And do we have all of them accounted for? Next is around the method of disseminating the information. So again, reflecting on historical practices that we may have found worked, may have found challenging, and then identifying for each individual subgroup, how do we want to handle that? Maybe it's email, maybe it's in a meeting or a presentation, maybe it's printed out and handed out to those particular groups. And then additionally, the readability. So what's the story we're telling? What language are we using to describe that story? And are we centering equity in that storytelling? And lastly, the accessibility. Questioning ourselves at the end before sharing that information out. Is it accessible to all of the groups that we've identified? And so we'd certainly love to hear from all of you here. What are the most common approaches that your organization has used in reporting and disseminating information out to internal and external stakeholders? And that may be something like an annual report, a board meeting, a parent meeting. And we know in this virtual space, things have had to shift and change. So if there's anything that you all have found helpful or that resonates, feel free to drop that in the chat.
And I think I see one of our polls popped up. So yeah, if we could just answer through the chat, we'll get to that poll question that just came up. Yeah, in your chat, is it, typical presentations, or do you have a board dashboard that you may have? We would love to hear how you typically disseminate your data to your stakeholders. Yeah, sorry about that last poll question. It was built around kind of just in a couple of more slides. We'll get to that one. That was a little bit early. Sorry about that. So just again, our question that we're looking for is, what are the most common ways that we report out our data through this process? Again, do you have family and community engagement nights where you use typical presentations, or maybe we're using monthly newsletters that give consistent updates. What type of ways are we disseminating our information to our stakeholders? Feel free to drop those into the chat. Tableau, okay, great. Tom, you'll appreciate some of the view that we get into in a second as well. We'll show some Tableau dashboards that we've developed for that usage. Thanks for sharing. Again, anybody else, feel free to share out. Mm-hmm. More, okay. Awesome. Well, again, we feel free to keep getting these answers in. We'll keep an eye on these. We appreciate you sharing. Yep. Charge share through board and PTO meetings. Okay, awesome. So again, yeah, feel free to drop those into the chat. Again, we're really about this shared learning. So there may be examples that individuals hear or see within the chat that they may think about as well. So we appreciate you all sharing there. We're gonna kick back into the applying our data visualizations.
Wonderful. So we are going to walk through a number of recommendations here and pull up that poll in just a moment on how we're focusing areas when we're working to be more inclusive and how we're presenting the data. So Iser, if you're able to launch that poll for us, really what we're looking to understand here from the group is, have you applied any types of equity frameworks when creating your data visualizations?
And I think, to speak towards an example of how we've seen this done, here in Chicago, we have in Chicago Public Schools, there's an equity framework, right? So making sure that, individuals and stakeholders are represented in the presentation of data is one of those priorities as well. So those are just different types of ways. There's plenty of different frameworks out there that can be utilized and used for this information. So again, we just want to know, is there something that you align to when you're thinking about your visualization, as we look to ensure that equity is at the center of how we're reporting. Yeah.
And again, as Nick mentioned, we'll walk through a few examples. So feel free to answer this with what may be coming up for you first, knowing that we will be walking through a number of examples, and it may help resonate with what you already are doing within your team right now. So Iser, if you don't mind, we can go ahead and show those results. Great. So seeing some variation here as well as across the board. So really excited to dive in to a number of these examples here. And first is around the language usage. So we often, when we pull up any chart, there's titles, there's text, there's labels being used. And one of the things that we can do is focus on using people first language. So an example would be using people experiencing homelessness versus homeless people. And using certain language can be framed to describe that individual only in one way. And so by using people's first language, we're able to show that this may be just one indicator that we're using to help represent this individual within a larger data collection cycle. Next on to the order and colors. So really here, it's taking the time to ensure that the ordering does not reinforce any gender or racial stereotypes. In my own experience, and preparing this presentation, being able to look across the board at different ways data is collected, seeing that labels are not always consistent, and taking a moment to pause here.
And for this one, Lauren, I think that that's the key, right? Is when we're thinking and kind of speaking towards the learning of and while using this research, this is something that made me reflect on my data practice as well. So again, none of us are perfect in these aspects, but just understanding how the representation and the purposefulness of the usage of color, right, or of othering groups, as we'll get into it in a second, but you can kind of see in the difference of these two examples where in example one, where our minority groups are almost seen in this red state. So first off, there's this connotation with red on anything, right? Red is seen as not doing as well. And then you see almost in example one that white race group is shown in a blue categorization, which is going to distinguish it a lot different from all of the other ones. And then also when you talk about like that international group, it's kind of gray, right? So in a heat map function, that would kind of just drown out that group as well. So those are kind of the things that we want to be sure that we're building and bringing into context. And in example two, there's a better representation and a way for us to kind of consistently improve on those areas as well. But as Lauren was mentioning, there's research behind all of this, and again, the purposefulness of how we're using our data and reflecting on it is key. Lauren, was there anything else on this one, or you want me to move on to the next?
Yeah, there was one other thing that I wanted to mention here is also, looking at the visualization once you identify those colors and being able to see, as you mentioned, like, can we still see this group being shown? For example, I looked at one yesterday and there was gray listed for one of the smallest groups that it was referring to. And it was hard to even see the line given the way the rest of the chart was set up. So really looking holistically at the visualization can help us identify whether this is aligned to the equity framework that we want to be using and had planned for at the beginning of our data cycle. Great. So as we continue on, considering the missing groups, this is an opportunity where we can start considering other language that we're using, other labels besides others. Many charts that we've seen has this included, and it can mitigate and not account for the individuals that we are seeking to represent. And we found through the research, often it's because these are smaller sample sizes. However, this doesn't mean we have to leave this group out. We can find creative and innovative ways to add new labels in, whether that's adding footnotes, whether that is, changing the text and formatting on the visualization. So again, we can provide that holistic story and really highlighting this group that we're seeking to share the information out about.
Yeah, and so Lauren, one tidbit I'll add here kind of came up in one of our other sessions that we were focusing on this, and it's not the removal, it's not the removal of the word other, right? It's specifically being able to tell the story of who's within that other group, right? So again, as Lauren mentioned, like a footnote within that dashboard or on that presentation, so that those individuals aren't lost, those racial demographics aren't lost and just lumped into one other one. So no, I think that that's really important. And again, a learning space that I've had in thinking about how do we create more equitable data visualizations.
Great, thank you, Nick. The next is around using icons and shapes with a human equity awareness. So when we're creating something like our annual reports or maybe presentations for parent engagement meetings, what are the visuals that we are using, and does it represent the entire community that we're talking about, all of our students, all of our community members, and taking the time to get innovative here. So we have found that mis or under representation of certain groups in imagery fails to take that equity approach and that awareness perspective within the visualizations themselves. And one of the things that we've done here at Innovare is tried to learn here as well. We created a back to school playbook last summer as so many leaders were transitioning back to school, and really identified ways where we could use imagery like this to represent all of the students, all of the leaders that we would be working with. And then demonstrating empathy. I talked about this a little bit in the beginning around how are we really centering the individual behind the data. So as you see here on the left-hand side, that traditional chart where it is just showing a highlight of the numbers, where in comparison to the right, we're actually seeing a visualization of the individuals, and it provides more connection. That is what this is going after here. How are we bridging a sense of connection, building trust between sharing out that data and the audience who may be taking in that data?
Yeah, I know, Lauren, this was a topic that we shared about where, I think there's even continued growth from here, right? Again, we only have a male and female representation. So again, making sure that, we have the ability to, take a lens that is inclusive of all, right? So knowing that some folks might not identify as just male or female, how can we ensure that when we're representing this data in this process and making sure, again, that stakeholder or that individual that's behind the data feels that they're appropriately represented and that their story is being told through a true lens.
Yeah, I agree. And I saw a question in the chat that I think it's important to respond to in terms of which one is better here. And I think it is so important for us as a team to be able to identify how we want to visualize this data. So for instance, in this image here, where we have the icon that is typically representative of a male gender, if we have a subgroup that is self-identified as that, and we can note that, maybe it's an important visual to use. However, if that information is not available to us, maybe we move towards having a more traditional chart. This opportunity here is for us to just pause and reflect. Can we be more creative and innovative with how we're visualizing the data? And if not, how are we contextualizing in other ways, or in other ways like when we're sharing out the report? Nick, is there anything else you would add there?
I don't think there's a right or a wrong to this work. Again, like just knowing, when we have a clear lens of the work, right? We want to just be sure that we do have representation. Again, here in Chicago Public Schools, I know that, the district has started to allow for students to identify their genders as well. So those sorts of context around the usage of language and how we visualize it, I think you nailed it with that point, Lauren.
Great, thank you, Nick. So on to these default visualization approaches. So it's similar to the graph that we had shown in the previous slide. That may be a chart that we are using day in and day out. And how is that already reinforcing what we may already know about certain groups, or historically what data has represented about certain groups? And this allows us to take a moment to really reflect, can we be more innovative with how we're showing the data? So as you see here on your screen, the ACT data, we're compiling and we're comparing groups. Whereas the data to the right, this is a breakdown among racial groups. So we can really see the progression and change over time and look at this group in a singular subset and work to understand their environment, the context. other support that may be provided within a particular group, and then look at it holistically. So we're able to understand storylines and look at it in more detail rather than just this traditional comparative visualization.
Yeah, no, that you said it perfectly, Lauren. No more 2 cents for me on this one.
Well, this brings us to the last piece, and so much of what we've mentioned here is around engaging and reflecting the lived experiences. As I certainly have shared, we are talking about individuals, students, community members behind the data. And as we are going to share it out, how are we really reflecting and ensuring that we're talking about the lived experiences of these individuals, not just the abstraction of the data? And so here are a few questions to reflect on. As Nick showed, and we will preview a little bit at the end, is we'll be sharing out some resources to provide questions that you can reflect on as you move through your data cycle, identifying new visualizations. And we're really excited to share that out. Nick, is there anything you would add on this one?
No, again, I think this is that opportunity to hear back from those stakeholders to make sure that we are representing them appropriately. But no, I think that was kind of a great wrap to this. And with that, what I'll do is I'll kind of take us a little bit more into how we actually apply this work into our infrastructure, and specifically I'll speak towards how we do this work at Inno or at Innovare and through Inno. So here is that data strategy app that we have. Again, this allows for us to centralize those data systems and triangulate that information for you. So here in just one example of the data visualization, you can kind of see this is data that was operationalized out of the continuing success research at a University of Chicago. Again, in best practice and in understanding where student performance is, the ability to slice and dice your data by particular race, gender, IEP status, right? To really ensure that we're able to tap into any particulars and any particular priority groups that we have. And then the ability to kind of create data literacy across the board as well, right? So for instance, this information is triangulated. Again, this is that nimbleness of our data sources, right? So it's triangulated from PowerSchool. It's brought in Dean's List and brought in academic approach to help in creating these measures. And then to allow for us to, see at a high level where we can see trends. So maybe this is information we're sharing with our boards or our LSCs. The ability for our leadership teams to kind of get down into, one step into that information to make sure that, we're able to see slice and dice by grade level. And we can see, hey, what's going on in 10th grade, right? We want to really prioritize and again, still being able to look into those individualized priority groups as well. Then starting to put the names behind these groups as well, right? So it's not just enough to say like, hey, we have 51 students off track, right? We want to be sure that we understand who those 51 students are. How do we personalize and start to make connections to those individualized students? And then lastly, getting down into that individualized student profile as well, right? So this is where we get to see a sense of who that student is and how they've trended across the board. We can really assess those interventions that we're putting into place and how we're really working to this prioritization work as well, that really allow for us. So in all of this, the design behind it is brought in a human-centered way as well, right? So at Innovare, like we don't come in with a cookie cutter dashboard that we're going to say, hey, this is how you're going to track engagement. It's really understanding the goals of the organization first and really working to, go through this process where we're designing and understanding who the users are and the stakeholder groups, like what measures of success do we have and how do we really want to drive that work? What sources of data are we pulling information from? What do we need to triangulate? What styles do we want our information visualized? Do we want the trend analysis for our board view? Do we want the individual student profile for our individual students? Like what types of charts and graphs do we like? Right? Do we not want to use a particular color? Do we want to use a particular label? Again, making sure that we're using that appropriate language. And most importantly for us is in the creation of these data visualizations, we want to be driving action, right? We don't want to create insights that don't drive you to next steps. So really ensuring that we have these structures in place and we have these data that drive us to those insights that allow for us to make those next actions are really the key of the work at Innovare. So again, making sure that we have these sources in place. So that's just a quick example of how we do some of the design behind our dashboard. Again, there's the strategy aspect that goes along with Inno as well, but we won't kind of dive too deeply into that today, or we won't dive into that today. But to kind of just close this out before we jump into some of those questions and answers, I did see a few come into the chat. Again, we crowdsourced a lot of this research, right? This is a lot of best practice that is out there, and there's plenty more to learn in these studies. I've been doing this data work for over 10 years now, and a lot of these studies, help me think about things a little bit differently. What you can kind of see on the right side on the screen right now is we'll be following up with more content for you, again, to be able to provide you with insights around this data, around the, ensuring that you're creating this, equitable cycle of learning and creating equitable data infrastructures as well, along with some, basic checklists to help you kind of self-assess. As Lauren was talking earlier and sharing a little bit about how we want to, ensure that we have a framework that we're aligned to. This is a potential framework if you don't have one. If you were one of those folks that said you didn't have a framework that you aligned to in this work, that's okay, right? That's the purpose of these sessions. That's for us together to come together, to learn together, to understand what resources and best practices are out there. So with that, Lauren, was there anything else that you would like to share before we jump into the questions?
No, I'm ready to look and see what questions we may have. I know a number of them had been answered so far, so let me just take a look quickly.
Okay. And feel free, if there's any other questions, feel free to use the chat now as well to drop any questions that you may have. Feel free to answer those as well.
We were able to get to all the questions here. So as Nick said, if you have any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A function. And know that we are here as well to answer any questions if they may, pop up as you're leaving the session here today.
Yeah, and as we're wrapping up again, I just want to say thank you all for joining us in this space. The same way as the founders of Innovare came together in collaboration of areas of expertise, we understand that it really takes a collaborative in this approach, right? So as we build our teams and build our structures to these processes, that information will consistently be shared. And again, this innovation community, as we call it, is where we really want to, again, build together and learn together. So we appreciate you all being here today. Anthony, I see your question. Yes, we will, as we close out this session, actually, automatically through Zoom, you will see that overall survey pop up for you as well. That will be sure to get your feedback. Again, we welcome all feedback. If there's any additional questions, don't hesitate to drop them into that survey for us. But again, if there's no other questions, we appreciate your time. Oh, and actually, I see the survey just got dropped into the chat. Thank you, Iser, for getting that in there for us. So Anthony, you can see that one there. Yeah, Wendy, I see your question here. Yes, we do support schools. When it isn't necessarily just a racial subgroup that we're particularly looking at, right? So kind of for everybody, if you actually, I just realized everybody can't see the question. I'm going to read it out for us. Do you help small schools look at data of those demographics that don't have enough to be a subgroup? Yes, right. Like at the end of the day, typically with our reporting structures, and again, this is in alignment with FERPA and in alignment with just policy around how we report out data, but that doesn't mean that we can't inform our strategy based on those data. So Wendy, I know over at Columbus, it's a smaller school, and knowing that we might have a population less than 10, right? For instance, where we typically wouldn't represent that data in a dashboard, we could still provide those insights around those students and ensuring that we can provide, whether it's those MTSS interventions, whether it's around SEL or academic, whatever it might be, we do have the ability to support those folks. But that is a great question, and I appreciate that one. Yes, if there's any questions about learning more about our support and kind of the different packaging that we have, whether it's based on district level or school level, please, yes, do book some time with us. I'm sure one of our team members can go ahead and drop a meeting link into the chat for us. And again, all of this information will be included in the follow-up email for you all as well. I know we got about 2 more minutes, so again, feel free to get your questions in. We're happy to support and answer any of those questions. And Lauren, was there anything else from your end?
No, we will be in touch with all of you. And again, feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all. We are more than happy to help in any way that we can.
We're about 2 minutes away. I know everybody, it is the end of a day. It's probably been a long one for everyone. I'm sure that there's plenty of things that you all have on your plates. I always say our our education leaders and folks in the education space are typically spinning about 17 different plates, right? So again, we appreciate you all for taking the time with us today to come and learn a little bit more about how we can be more equitable in the usage of our data. And again, for us, this content is research and best practice, right? And again, these are processes that we build and we develop to within internally by operationalizing this research. Again, there's consistent learning that can be done. I definitely suggest and would ask that all of you all to learn a little bit more, dive into those resources, right? There's a ton of great content. Again, as I mentioned, I've been doing this work for 10 plus years now, and I still found some great things. I'm sure my team could share a little bit more about my excitement on this work, but again, that could be for another day. But to kind of just close this out, I just wanted to say thank you to Lauren for facilitating alongside with me, and I appreciate everybody from my team on the setup and the implementation here. If there are any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to all of our folks out there in the Twitter sphere and the Facebook sphere and all of our social media channels. We really appreciate you all being here with us today. And again, we look forward to our next session with you all. And that's all for us today. So again, we appreciate you all and look forward to seeing you all in the near future. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.